Hello everyone. The previous videos that we've put up for this class were based on Greek philosophy. So we looked at the pre-Socratics, then Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle. But now we'd like to try and take a big leap forward actually, and start to consider some of the modern philosophers. Before we do that, I wanted to try and fill the gap a little bit. I mean, it's a huge span of time between the Greeks and the early moderns, and the transitions that we're talking about in this particular video. But I think it helps frame a little bit what was taking place in the medieval world, and then what's going to be taking place in the modern era, and the changes that occur that bring us into the modern era, or characteristics of what the modern era actually is. So these three, I mean, I have emblems for each of the transitions. On the left is a picture called the Vitruvian Man. That's from Leonardo da Vinci. So that represents the Renaissance. On the right, we have Martin Luther, and he represents the Protestant Reformation. In the center, we have Galileo, who represents for us, I mean, the scientific revolution. So those three transitional movements, I mean, in history, bring us to the verge of modernity, and we want to try and look at them and see philosophically what each of them contributes, trying to go forward. One of the things that happens at the end of the ancient period of history, or the time of the Greeks and then the Romans, was the rise of Christianity. So we could say that if the fall of Rome is usually dated about 476 AD, and by that time Christianity has already gradually become a powerful religious force in the Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean part of the world. So the period of history that follows the fall of the Roman Empire, we refer to that as the medieval era. And the medieval era, I mean, extends all the way from the fall of Rome to maybe like the 14th century, 13th or the 14th century, before the beginnings of modern viewpoints begin to make themselves felt. So throughout the medieval world, Christianity has become the dominant religion in that world, and centered in European, say Western Europe primarily. And you could say that the whole medieval period is dominated by what I'm going to refer to as a God-centered mindset. And then that's an interesting characteristic of this era, because it says a lot about how people saw themselves and saw the world that they lived in. And then, especially as a result of these transitions we're going to look at, by the time we get into the modern era of history, that mindset is shifted and becomes more of a human-centered mindset. So that's one of the prominent transitions that we want to take a look at. Throughout the medieval world, you say Christianity is probably the most powerful institution that existed. There were also secular lords, I mean, aristocracy, nobility, and so forth, and they also had power, but they shared it with the church. I mean, so those are the two primary power bases, that of the spiritual lords representing Christianity and the secular lords representing the aristocracy. In this God-centered era, you could say that all significant endeavors were for the greater glory of God. So not for the sake of the individual self would you undertake projects or other things that you were trying to accomplish, but everything would be dedicated to the greater glory of God. Artworks, building projects, military conquest, you could say the Crusades, pilgrimages. People were burdened with a pretty dark view of what it meant to be a human being. If you compared yourself against the perfection of God, who was always ever present, individual humans came off as pretty lowly creatures and did not count for very much. Human beings had, again, compared to God, had finite existences, limited capabilities, and were viewed as being inclined towards sin. You'd say this earliest stage of the medieval world was referred to as the Dark Ages. So it was a period after the fall of Rome and kind of the disintegration of the Roman Empire. Let's say the social and political life devolved into what we call the feudal system. So for most people, that was a pretty dark period, and I mean exteriorly and also interiorly, and pretty bleak. If we consider something like pride, for instance, during the medieval era, pride was considered one of the 7 deadly sins. I think all of the 7 deadly sins were based on the idea of too much of the self is involved. And it's like turning towards yourself instead of turning toward God. So turning away from God was considered a sin. And pride was one of the ways you might be too focused on yourself. The preferred virtue was therefore humility, and not to put yourself forward. Most artists during the medieval era didn't even sign their names to their creations. The idea was that whatever it was you were trying to accomplish, you would do so, to be of service to God, not to be of service to yourself. So that's part of the mindset that weighed down on people, I would say. Another symbol of the role that religion played in the lives of people were the great Gothic cathedrals, which were built really more towards the latter parts of the medieval period. But the great Gothic cathedrals, you can say they dominated the landscape much in the same way as religion did. The cathedrals were religious institutions, religious, architecture meant for the worship of God. But they, if you think about here in our own little Pittsburgh, for instance, consider how the Cathedral of Learning in Oakland, how it dominates its surroundings, and you can see it from far away, actually. So you could say so with religion in the lives of people of the era. And religion was at the center of everything. dominated their landscape. From, you'd be born, baptized in the church, married in the church, and buried in the church as well. So the whole of your life would be have a religious background for it. If we consider what the state of affairs was in the field of philosophy, we could say that throughout the medieval era, philosophy did persist and in certain respects thrived, but it was heavily influenced by Christian theology. All of the major philosophers during the period were Christians. And that pretty much started with almost at the beginning of the medieval era with the philosopher slash Saint Augustine, and who lived in the 4th, 5th century and was alive or died, roughly around the same time that the Roman Empire collapsed. Augustine was very much inspired by the philosophy of Plato and gave Christianity a kind of Christian reading of Plato. Augustine saw Plato as providing a kind of intellectual framework or justification of Christian belief. So that was a strong influence throughout the period. Getting towards the latter part of the medieval era, another famous philosopher slash saint, Aquinas, near the end of the period, let's say like 13th century, was intrigued and inspired by the philosophy of Aristotle and gave Christianity and the world a Christian reading of Aristotle. So the end result of these two thinkers in particular gave us a kind of blend of Greek philosophy with Christian theology, which was a pretty powerful mix, which we still feel the effects of even today, I would say. And in their minds, faith and reason were not in competition with each other, but they actually complemented each other in the life of an individual human being. So they didn't compete exactly, but both of them were ways of approaching the truth. And ultimately, the thought was that there's only one truth, and that's God truth, and reason is a legitimate path to it. And faith is also a legitimate path to it. Faith in the divine revelations, such as in the Bible. So in the minds, you would say Augustine and Aquinas made significant contributions in the field of philosophy that were strictly philosophical, but faith is always in the background, and you could say that faith always had the last word when it came to determining what is. In the field of science, we could say that science also persisted, scientific endeavors were, but it was still dominated by Aristotle's foundations in the sciences. Aristotle's way of doing science was still the model for medieval scientists, to continue their work. You could say that meant working with his 4 causes and assuming that everything had a final cause or a telos. You say that was Aristotle assumed a teleological view of the natural world, and that everything all things had purposes built into their natures, which determined what their purpose was, or what their function was, or what their end was, what they aimed at. So that was still a kind of guideline for people who were interested in pursuing the natural sciences. The other thing that, I wouldn't say it came from Aristotle, but he contributed to it, was this geocentric view of the world, in which the earth was at the center of everything. And surrounding the earth, you would have, I think in Aristotle, the four elements, earth would be the material earth would be at the center of everything, and then water, and then air, and then fire, and then the heavens, the ether, above that, and even the heavenly bodies rotated in their perfectly circular patterns in accordance with the way people wanted to think that everything was arranged. So this geocentric view, sort of being locked into this feeling that you had to identify purposes for everything that you were studying, were two of the principles that kind of held back science in a way. During this time period, we'll see that when we go forward, scientists are going to have to liberate themselves from these ways of seeing things. So all of this that we've presented so far just provides us with a glimpse of how the world was viewed during the medieval time. And we'll see that gradually it's going to morph into the modern era. Our primary goal in this video is to talk about those transitional developments, and we're referring to the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the scientific revolution. So the traditional authorities in both religion and science will be challenged as a result of these transitions, and a new mindset will begin to emerge for Western peoples. So we're going to start with the Renaissance, a real period of flourishing, I think, in respect to the arts in particular. Some of the most famous, and depicted some of the most famous works of art that come from this era. And it's amazing that this is back in the 14th, 15th century, but all these images are still familiar to us because they're such significant contributions to the art in our history. On the top left, is just a detail from The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. In the center, also the Mona Lisa by da Vinci as well. On the bottom left, I think we used this in our Aristotle presentation. You have Michelangelo's statue of the biblical figure David. On the top right, we also have a detail from the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling in the Vatican, that Michelangelo painted, and depicting kind of the creation of human beings by God. That's a very interesting image. It's layered with meaning in my view, and you see God reaching out to man, and man kind of half-heartedly trying to reach back. In the bottom right, we have another picture that we used earlier, which is the School of Athens by Raphael. So these are very significant contributions in the world of art were made during this time period. But it was more than just art for this era. So the Renaissance, and we say location-wise, primarily in Italy, in the south of Europe. We could say time-wise includes 15th and the 16th century. Literally, Renaissance is a rebirth, and we say, in this case, it is a kind of rebirth. It's kind of life coming back into the medieval era, but it's also a rebirth of the classical ideals that were characteristic of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So in Italy, in particular, there was kind of nostalgia for the grandeur of these great civilizations in the past. And there were a lot of reminders of those civilizations because there were ruins everywhere that still remained from them. But there was a kind of longing for, once again, that type of society, and a renewed interest in the art and the philosophy of the ancients. These two cultures, the Romans and the Greeks, were very much human-centered cultures. You'd say they also had their religions, but they were very different from the religion of Christianity. Their gods were human-like, not like the Christian God, sort of remote and like a kind of ideal. But the Greeks and the Romans had gods that were like humans, except stronger and longer lived. They were immortal. And they were far from morally perfect. So it made it a little easier to be a human being in that time period. I mean, if you measured yourself against the gods, it wasn't the same as trying to measure yourself against the Christian God. So there was kind of some liberating aspect to that way of seeing religion. So in the Renaissance, we see a renewed interest in what it means to be a human being. We could say that's a return to humanism in a way. And there was the feeling that each individual human being had a kind of inestimable worth or value, that each individual human being had a kind of dignity contained within his or her own self. And one of the key elements of that was the fact that each person had a rational capacity. So this enabled us, a more positive feeling about what it meant to be a human being. You didn't have to think of yourself as something lowly or inclined towards sin necessarily. But although that still might be an aspect of things, but human beings had a lot of positive qualities. And we see in the Renaissance even a kind of celebration of the individual was included in the way people saw things. If we look at the artists, for instance, in the Renaissance, at least some of them were familiar with the big names, but there were some really bigger than life figures, and who were clearly proud of their achievements and also ambitious. They promoted themselves even. So we see this shift in terms of virtue where now pride is okay. It's not one of the 7 deadly sins so much, and you don't have to be unduly humble in, when it comes to taking credit for your achievements. So pride instead of humility. Christianity is still everywhere in this world, but there's a new way of thinking about what it means to be a human being. A new mindset has emerged already, and a mindset that doesn't weigh down on people so much. There's still a lot of religious art, clearly, in the world of art, but also human art, art depicting ordinary humans. What's telling that a lot of the Renaissance painters and sculptors created nude figures, painted and sculpted them. And this didn't happen so much in the medieval world, where human figures are always fully clothed all the time, and kind of the depictions of them were highly stylized. But in the Renaissance, you get a lot of pictures of nude figures, and it sort of indicates that the human body is seen as something which is beautiful in itself, and not a source of sinfulness, not something to be hidden away necessarily or ashamed of. So that's a very different attitude about even the outer form of human beings. Then we wanted to move on into the Protestant Reformation, and on this entry slide I've put up some images of that era. And so on the left is probably the most significant figure, and that's Martin Luther. I've heard it said, and people who have great man sort of interpretations of history, that it's rarely the case that a single person really creates a lot of changes. But I think in the crash course video, it's said that that doesn't seem to be the case, that Martin Luther really was a mover in terms of getting the Protestant Reformation moving. So that's him on the left. In the center is a symbol that he adopted, kind of rose with a heart and a cross in the center, which represents for him and what he believed, about religion, what was necessary. On the right is a printing press, which was so significant in Luther's becoming a really significant figure, is that the things that he wrote, the pamphlets, and probably most significantly his translation of the Bible, the fact that they could be printed and widely distributed was a huge contribution to the movement. The Protestant Reformation took place in the north of Europe. It was that the Renaissance was centrally focused in the south. The Protestant Reformation's in the north. I think it begins in Germany. And famously, Martin Luther in 1517 posted his objections to the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, in particular their selling of indulgences. So Luther in 1517 posted a list of his objections to church practices on the door of a church in Wittenberg. And he's inviting discussion or reconsideration of some of these practices. So initially he just wanted to reform the church and the Roman Catholic Church, not replace it. Luther himself was a monk, an Augustinian monk, and was dedicated to the church, but he had his ideas about what the church should be and what it should represent. And he was a bit of a purist, and he was put off by what was going on in the Roman Catholic Church at the time. You consider the Roman Catholic, this is 1517, the Roman Catholic Church had probably been in the dominant church, or really the only, in the European theater at least, was the supreme authority on religious questions for like over 1,000 years at this point already. So too much power creates conditions where kind of abuses are more tempting for people, and the church had become pretty corrupt at this time period. So Luther sought reform. So he got his day in court. But it was quickly became apparent to him that the church wasn't willing to make any reforms, and instead Luther was rejected. So this kind of forced him to separate from the Roman Catholic Church and sort of start his own religious group, which clearly was Lutheranism. This is the first step in the beginning in the rise of Protestantism, this protest movement, which quickly spread across northern Europe in particular, through the Scandinavian countries and into England as well. So it's primarily a religious movement or a religious reform movement, but some of the philosophical ideas that we spoke about in the Renaissance are also play a significant role in this, and it's going to be humanism. Again, focus on individual human beings and their capabilities are going to come to the focus. Luther is really, one of the things you could say is that what he's doing is he's really challenging the role of the church in the life of any Christian. So the Roman Catholics had this assumed that the church had a specific role in the life of in Christians. We'll talk about that on the next slide. The traditional Roman Catholic Church saw its role as an intermediary between God and ordinary Christians. The members of the church, the people, were expected to relate to God through relating to the church. You could say the church assumed this role after Jesus was gone. So, and you could say just like Jesus was a kind of intermediary between God and ordinary human beings, you could say that Jesus was a kind of intercessor, because in his very nature Jesus was both human and divine at the same time. He provided a way for humans to be linked with God through him. So when Jesus was gone, the church assumed that role of intercessor. And the church, when it took on this role of intercessor, intermediary between God and ordinary human beings, it had teaching authority, so it taught people what the doctrines were and how they should worship and all that stuff. It provided forgiveness of sins. It took confessions and things like that. So this was kind of, you would have a relationship with God, but it would be through your relationship with the church, kind of indirect relationship with God, a direct relationship with the church. Luther really had a different vision of what the role of the church should be, and he believed that individuals could have more of a direct and personal relationship with God, and it didn't have to be through the church. They didn't have to go through an intermediary. Luther's goal was facilitated when he translated the Bible into the German vernacular. Unlike the academic Latin translations that the Roman Church used, you had to know Latin in order to read the Bible, and the only people who knew Latin were people who were in the church, monks, and so forth. So ordinary people couldn't read the Bible for themselves. They had to rely on the church to explain it to them. But when Luther's translation of the Bible into a common language that people could read, and also the invention of the printing press, which made this translation readily available to large numbers of people, that excuse me, that people could read and decide for themselves what God required of them. This corresponds with the humanism that we referred to earlier. The idea that each individual person has within himself the ability to read and to understand and decide for himself what the Bible sort of tells him about what his religious practices should be. So everyone, each individual person has this rational capacity, and this rational capacity gives each individual kind of dignity within themselves that ultimately requires respect of each individual as well. So people didn't really need the higher authority of the church in order to instruct them as to how to worship. Really, all they needed was to read for themselves, and ultimately just all they needed was faith by itself. As one of the videos indicated, sola fide was the expression. And the invention of the printing press made this possible. You know, in the earlier medieval world, there wasn't much literacy, and the church could occupy a more authoritative position in the life of people because people couldn't read the Bible for themselves. But now, moving into the modern era, this is possible, and it changes the nature of religion a great deal.
Okay, then the last stage or the last transition that I wanted to comment on is the scientific revolution. It's a bit later than the others, and the changes it brings maybe occur more gradually. But we've already looked at the Renaissance and changes it brought in terms of the way people thought about themselves, a kind of more positive view. And then you could say the Reformation brought about changes in the way that people thought about religion. So also in the field of science, gradually scientists were beginning to find new ways of doing science. On this intro slide, I've included three of the most famous scientists from this era. I think in order: Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton. And I've also included this quote that was used in the video we watched on the scientific revolution. A famous quote: "If I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of the giants." Ordinarily, this is attributed to Newton, but it's a good metaphor for how science develops in general also. So it's the idea that the achievements of our predecessors make it possible for us to achieve the the level of understanding and insight that we have on the nature of things today. So, and really, these are really three of the giants upon whose shoulders we stand.
As we discussed earlier, this revolution, the scientific revolution, and contributions of Galileo, Copernicus, and ultimately Newton, were based on challenging and overthrowing the traditional authority up to this time period in terms of how to do science, and that was Aristotle. That meant that Aristotle's insistence on identifying final causes, which meant identifying purposes which are built into things, was replaced by, again, this is Aristotle's terminology, but what Aristotle referred to as efficient causes. If you remember, efficient causes were more focused on trying to explain how something came into existence, kind of in a direct kind of connection, what brought something actually into existence, trying to understand that, and didn't involve any assumption that there were purposes in terms of how things came about or what the end result was. So that was one major element that the modern scientists or the scientists of this period had to overcome, and pretty quickly I think they did. The other assumption was this represented by the geocentric vision of our solar system, which we said was endorsed by Aristotle, also by Ptolemy, was ultimately overthrown by Copernicus with his heliocentric version of the solar system. We call this the Copernican revolution. And this was also a major shift. It was really a way of turning things upside down in terms of how we saw our place in the greater cosmos or in the greater world. And this shift would have significant consequences not only in science but also in the field of religion as well. So Copernicus's revolution, you could say, in the field of astronomy really kind of turned things upside down in a way. And if we say, if you can have a revolution, there has to be an old theory which is replaced by a new theory. So if we take a look at the old theory, and we've already said that was the geocentric theory, with the idea being that the Earth is at the center of everything, and everything else revolves around the Earth, planets, the sun, the moon, stars, and more distant heavenly bodies. And this was, we said, endorsed by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and also by the Roman Catholic Church, because this theory supported the Christian creation story and placed the earth and mankind even at the very center of everything that existed. And that seemed to correspond with the idea that God had created everything and put human beings right in the middle of his creation. This, common sense or the appearances of things supported this theory as well, because it's certainly when we in our ordinary experience we see that the sun rises in the morning and sort of reaches a midpoint, and then it sets in the evening. It looks as though we're standing still and the sun is moving around us, and so at least we have that appearance. And likewise with the moon, we would follow the path of the moon as it sort of comes up on one horizon, goes across the sky, and comes down on the other horizon. It looks like the moon is revolving around us. If we consider now, in the light of a better understanding, we see that it's not so much that the sun and the moon are moving around us, but it's more the case that we, as the observers on the earth, are moving with respect to those heavenly bodies. So the earth is constantly rotating on its axis. So when the sun rises, it's really the earth moving, rotating towards the sun. So Copernicus's new theory sort of took this into account. And we said his new theory was the heliocentric theory. And it assumed, instead of the earth being at the middle of everything, the sun was at the middle of everything. And this view was instantly rejected by the church without really very much consideration, I would say. There wasn't any openness to the church adapting its views to newfound discoveries in the field of science. So the church felt that this was a harmful theory, because it conflicted with what the church had traditionally believed, church dogma, and it actually displaced the earth. Not only were human beings and the earth not at the center, but actually they were far from the center, and this was troubling to the church, and they had a hard time accepting it. So the church was resistant to this new theory, didn't want to accept it. And the only problem was that, which is a big problem, that Copernicus, with the help of the newly developed telescope provided by Galileo, could demonstrate or could show that his view was correct. And that, if you wanted to assume that the earth was the center of everything, it couldn't be held up by direct observation. So that was one thing, that Copernicus could provide evidence for his theory. Furthermore, when Copernicus established this theory and he took into account the movement of the observer, it made a big difference in how you understood what it was you were actually seeing when you looked into the sky, into the night sky. If you're trying to understand the movements of the heavenly bodies, what you're trying to study and make sense out of and so forth, you can make much better sense out of their movements if you take into account the fact that you, the observer, are moving with respect to them as you observe them. You take your own movement into account, you get a better understanding of how things actually move on their own. So the theory, there are strong arguments for accepting the theory, but the church continued to reject it. They kind of punished people like Galileo, placed him under house arrest for the remainder of his life and so forth. And the church effectively dragged its feet, sorry for the misspelling here, and dragging its feet, it lost credibility in the fields of science and philosophical thinkers. And and sort of damaged the church's position ultimately by refusing to accept what it looked like there was sound evidence that they should accept. So from going forward then, now the science and religion could no longer be seen as complements of each other, because it looked like They gave opposing views of what the true nature of reality was. So instead of complementing each other, now they came into conflict. You had the religious explanation of the world and a scientific explanation of the world, and they said very different things. This is really another sign of what's going to happen in the modern world.